everyone, welcome to Module 5. We're going to go ahead and go over your project that you have to complete in this module. This one is a little bit more involved than the previous ones. There's a lot more questions to answer. So when you click on the link, it'll take you to the guidelines and rubric link, and you're going to want to review that. Now remember, you're still using your same scientific topic, and in this module the project has been broken up into two parts. So in part 2 we're looking at information gaps, how that can present ethical implications, how that impacts bias, and then in part 3 we're talking about the importance of collaboration. And there's a lot of good information about these things in this module in your reading and resources, so make sure that you review that. There is a template here, just like in the other ones, so we can open that up, and you see that it's really just what the questions are to answer, so you can use this to make sure that you've addressed each question, or you can use the rubric as usual as a checklist to help you address things as well. So I'm going to kind of walk you through some examples that that I have put together just for each kind of question. So looking at information gaps, and I'm going to actually get out of the of the slideshow view because it's cutting off my my data. So let's say that I am looking at the first question and it's asking you, what gaps are there between what the data says and public perception surrounding this issue. So in my, examples of fracking, a lot of people based, on this table right here have not even heard about it. And honestly, that is going to be very specific to local areas because fracking can only be done in certain areas. So in Colorado, we have a lot of fracking, but, and kind of out like in Pennsylvania area, there's a lot of fracking, but there's not as much in, like the northwestern states. So there's an information gap there. This particular graphic is looking at people's understanding of, how they feel about the COVID-19 vaccine versus the MMR vaccine. Now, both of these were pretty controversial. MMR, there was a fraudulent study done about MMR vaccine causing autism that has been discredited. And then a lot of people were very skeptical of the COVID-19 vaccine because of how quickly it was made, and there was a lot of misinformation surrounding it. So there's gaps between, what the data says, which is that these two vaccines are very helpful in preventing the disease, or the various diseases, versus what the public perceives from them. The next part is about the ethical implications of these gaps. So how can these information gaps impact experimental results? How might those gaps impact funding? How can it impact decision making? So if we use like the previous example, right, if there's this information gap that was perpetuated for a long time, was that fracking was much cleaner. It didn't produce as much water pollution, air pollution, greenhouse gases. And so because of that being kind of pushed out there, more people were willing to fund it. They were okay with having it near their homes. And then once it turned out that was not accurate, there was starting to be pushback on that, and now they don't want those things. So another good example would be electric cars. So like recently in my community, There's a big push for everyone to have electric cars. There's even grants to like help people obtain electric cars. But they didn't think about the infrastructure. So that's an information gap, right? Like in order for these electric cars to be able to work and replace gas powered cars, there needs to be charging stations. And there's not very many in our town, and people's homes have to kind of be retrofitted. You know, they may not have like the outlet that they need to have for the electric car, and it can be expensive to put in there. So it you know, your information gaps can cause problems. I am trying to find my part here. There we go. Okay, so sorry about that. So the next part is how bias can impact the validity and reliability of the data. So bias is always impacting things, whether we try to avoid it or not. There's always at least some kind of thing in there. You have to work very hard to remove bias from data and research. So this kind of goes into like data might be cherry picked. So, you know, what that means is that the scientist or the people might look at the data and only pick the good outcomes and ignore the bad outcomes. Confirmation bias could play a role where, you know, you're just trying to do the research to confirm what you are looking at, and you don't really pay attention to, you know, all the other evidence that's pointing to something different. So in this particular graphic right here, this is talking about death rates from energy production. And so what you can see is that, you know, coal and oil produce a lot of death from air pollution and accidents, whereas nuclear doesn't produce a lot. However, because there was such a large media presence and things like around nuclear accidents like Chernobyl and Fukushima, a lot of people are very, very scared of nuclear energy and having a nuclear power plant near them. But if you can, you know, but the data suggests that that's not something that they should be concerned about as much. Really, they ought to be concerned about more of the oil and gas industry stuff. And so that kind of looks at this part right here. You know, the fracking. So it was originally believed that it produces less greenhouse gas, and they kind of ignore the fact that it actually uses a lot of water. It can pollute the water, it can pollute the air, and looking at like the economic cost of it. So there is bias in here. The next section is about media bias. So what are the implications of media bias? So we kind of talked about this in previous weeks about how, depending on like what media organization you're consuming information from, could determine how that information is presented to you. So if you're into, you know, if you're watching a more like conservative news outlet, they're going to give you a skewed view of the issue, versus if you're watching a more liberal outlet, they're going to give you their own version of it. So, you know, a conservative, like let's just take climate change, for example. So a conservative outlet is probably going to present, you know, that climate change is less likely to be man-made and is more a natural occurrence. Whereas a more liberal outlet may be presenting that climate change is caused by humans, and we really need to do something about it. And so, you know, that's kind of looking, you could also look at, you know, an environmental organization is going to present environmental issues much differently and from different perspectives than, you know, like CNN or the Times. So there's always bias in there, and you just want to explain in this particular case, like how would this issue be presented from these different viewpoints? The next part is, how would you communicate information about your topic to diverse audiences? So what strategies are you going to kind of employ to communicate this information to others who might not be familiar with the topic and are unfamiliar with like the scientific jargon? So this is kind of just like an example. And we discussed this, I believe, in your journal and your project one, about how this was going to come up. So, you want like 2 or 3 examples of different ways you could communicate, these issues. After that, you go into part 3. So part 3 is all about collaboration and community. So this part, you're going to explain the importance of collaboration within the scientific community, to, kind of advance your chosen issue. So how can collaboration essentially help with your issue? A lot of times it's all about funding, being able to have funding for research, collaborating with other experts in the field in order to gather data and perform experiments. So if you want to take an example of like cleaning up plastic pollution in the ocean, there needed to be a collaboration between not just environmental scientists, but oceanographers and, engineers to make the machines that could help, kind of sift through the plastic pollution from the ocean. So those are like good examples of how collaboration has to occur with multiple disciplines. And, they had to get lawmakers on board with allowing them to go into international waters to clean up the plastic. The next part is looking at contributions of the scientific community. So what different fields has the scientific community worked with to address the issue? So if we could take the issue of like microplastics, the community had to go in and work with the waste division people, the city trash people, environmental scientists, policymakers, in order to kind of put forth like a microplastic cleanup idea. And so because of that, now we have had more recycling. There's been some plastic waste bans, and it's improved or impacted the community by there's less plastic waste and there's less PFAS chemicals in our water sources. And then the final piece of this project is the diverse perspectives piece. Sorry, I can't talk today. So you're going to explain the importance of diverse perspectives within the scientific community regarding your chosen issue. So you want to consider perspectives of different groups. So for instance, for the fracking, right, like there's a very different perspective about fracking from an environmentalist versus a gas worker. The gas worker, that's their livelihood. That's how they're feeding their families. In their opinion, like, what other way are you going to get energy? In certain areas it's more efficient and it's less money, so there's an economic benefit to it. Whereas an environmentalist is going to very hardcore be against fracking because of all the air and water pollution that can arise from it. There's earthquakes that can occur from a fracking well that releases the gas. Another issue that you could look at would be deforestation, right? So there's ethnical and cultural perspectives from the tribes in different rainforests and different forest ecosystems that need that forest for shelter, food, medicine. And they are going to have a very different perspective versus a rancher who wants that land cleared for livestock, or even for people who, like a corporation who wants to go in there and use the forest for timber, right? For timber production. So, like I said, this is a lot. If you need help, please reach out. Use that template and just let me know. And I look forward to seeing your projects.